Our second presentation is on an investigation of creative power and the value wide color gamut brings to motion picture mastering from Mr. Jake Duena. Jake Duena is a recent graduate of RIT with bachelor's degrees in motion picture science. While at RIT, he performed a senior research project to assess the creative performance of highly saturated colors in motion picture mastering workflows. Upon graduation, he began working as an applied vision science intern for Dolby Laboratories in the Imaging Applied Research Division. Please welcome Mr. Duena.
Okay. Thank you, Sally. So as we mentioned, this research was done at RIT for completion of my degree in motion picture science. And within it, I wanted to look at how people react to the presence of highly chromatic and highly saturated color content in movie images. And the inspiration for the research came from the expanding world of wide color gamut and how it could be incorporated into mastering workflows. So it goes without saying that when you increase the available color gamut capable in a technology, it offers exceedingly more colors to artists and creatives who are mastering their work. Now, it goes without saying also that the creators are still very much in the driver's seat when it comes to how much of this expanded gamut is really used. It's really just a capability of the technology and not a necessity of the mastered image. But how much would be appropriate? And that was the major question that led me to the basic thing I asked in this research, which was whether or not a colorist or color artist would choose to grade content past the boundaries of HD TV or digital cinema if given the resources to do so. Now, that's a pretty loaded question considering it's also very vague, as a lot of the decisions that go into mastering motion picture content comes from what that content actually is. And that leads to a very important related question of this research, which asks, is there a type of content or medium of filmmaking that lends itself well to a wide gamut master? Is something like animation, which is entirely created by artists, more welcoming to the highly chromatic and very saturated colors that the wider gamuts offer than something like a live action drama that is supposed to be more grounded in reality? Regardless of what content is being mastered and the display being used, there is an overall question that this research is asking, which is what kind of value does wide gamut bring to the table when we discuss its capabilities in motion pictures? If we find that creatives are not preferring to push their content into the expanded boundaries of laser projectors, is it really an appropriate or valuable tool to add into the creative arsenal? So as I mentioned previously, a lot of the colors that are exclusive to the wider gamuts are very saturated, very vivid, and I wanted to give a brief overview on sort of the history behind human perception and preference of saturation. So before we get into that, I did want to make mention that saturation is not an individual entity, and it takes influence from both the hue and luminance of the color. So that's something that's going to be really important when discussing saturation as a whole. There is actually an old rule that people prefer their images to be more saturated than things appear in real life, and that goes mainly for memory colors like blue sky and green grass. However, human skin tones, people tend to like things that are more one-to-one with the scene color imagery. The idea of the preferred saturation levels was something that was actually incorporated into the design of Kodak consumer films. So following any perturbations made to visual phenomena, these films did receive about a 15% boost in color saturation that was purely aesthetic. Of course, the skin tones were engineered to maintain how people wanted them to look. Now, the idea of boosting an overall image's saturation was one that I took when creating the stimuli for my preference experiment. I wanted to run my images through a processing routine that could create a series of images with differing chroma values that could be evaluated for observer preference. Now, it's important for me to alter these images only along the saturation axis. I didn't want there to be any spill into the luminance or hue parts of the color, so I needed to find a color space that had the three axes very decorrelated from one another that would allow for me to have the colors appear with the extended saturation. So for that reason, I decided to pick the ICtCp color space. But of course, in order to saturate my images in ICtCp, I had to get them into ICtCp. So I started, as you can see from the workflow diagram on the screen, I started with a linear RGB image and put it through the top workflow to get into ICtCp before I applied a scaling coefficient to the chromatic channels and then sent it back out through the inverse workflow before encoding the images in XYZ prime for digital cinema showcase. So you will notice that I do have a gamut remap built into my inverse workflow, and that was done out of necessity because when I was saturating the images, the components that were already very vivid to begin with were being pushed outside of the display capabilities. And when that happened, upon going through the inverse workflow without the gamut remap, those images were receiving a lot of clipping artifacts, which I could not afford in a study based on preference. I wanted to make sure that these selections were being made on saturation preference, not artifact avoidance. So I needed to perform a gamut remap to make sure that everything was properly represented. So I did decide to do the gamut mapping while still in the uniform ICtCp color space, and it basically worked as a rubber band function. So once I understood the ICtCp hull that the color volume of the display I was using supported, I was able to look at the relative position of the saturated pixels at each hue angle and then kind of bring the ones that were outside of the hull back in. It was important to create a function that kept the pixels that were within the hull to begin with following the saturation relatively in the same spot because I didn't want the images to become desaturated after performing the gamma mapping. So as you can see by the graphics depicting the arbitrary look of what the gamut mapping looked like, all of the in-gamut colors were kept in relatively the same spot. They did need to move out of the way a little bit, though, to avoid any overlap with the colors being rubber banded back in, because overlap would lead to artifacts, and again, we don't want those. So again, as I mentioned with the gamut mapping routine, it was all based off of what display I was using. So in order to pick the display for this experiment, I very simply looked to find the largest available color gamut at RIT, which was a 4K Christie laser projector. As we can see by the diagrams on the screen, it does a very good job at offering a wide range of colors for incorporation and view of the expanded saturation. And for those of you keeping score at home, at hue angle 47, it actually has higher chroma capabilities than Rec 2020. All right, so we've talked about how to process the images and how to display the images. Now let's talk about the study and the images themselves. So the images that I selected were based on different types of content. The content that I wanted to select was a human skin tone, a CG animated character, and a scene of a natural landscape. So I picked these three as they represented very different types of content that you would expect to have different levels of preferred saturation. Now, of course, these images and the results that come with them are not going to represent the ground truth of skin tone, CG animation, and natural scenery of what people prefer, but they do provide the proper boundaries that make the content discrimination appropriate. So for each image, I ran them through the saturation pipeline 8 times, creating the different variations, where they were scaled by coefficients ranging from 0.5 to 4.0, where a coefficient of 1.0 represented the original image. And following that, I was able to build a paired comparison experiment where observers were to select which one of the two presented to them they felt was the most visually pleasing. So there was a lot of careful consideration taken into selecting these images, and I wanted to make sure that they had very similar scene colors and, more importantly, were displaying equal levels of chromaticness. Now that's very important, as if they started out at different levels of saturation, different levels of vividness, the 1.0 coefficient would not be very comparable between the three of them, and the selections made by the observers wouldn't really be appropriate for direct comparison. So as you can see by the mean chroma IPT from the saturated images on the screen, I did a pretty good job at picking images that showed a relative level of chroma. There was some difference, and I did have to tweak the images in post-production a little bit just to get them close, but I didn't want to make any alterations that would cause the 1.0 coefficient to look unnatural. So this is what we got, and we thought it was pretty close. So something that was really neat about the coefficients was once we started saturating by a coefficient of 2.0 or higher, a lot of the images began to showcase pixels outside of the digital cinema gamut, which was really cool as our observers were going to be looking and making decisions based on colors that they don't see in standard cinema. So we were actually looking at wide gamut material. So the setup for my experiment was kind of interesting. I did it in a color correction suite, so the furniture and the walls, everything was black, which was really nice. I took my laptop and I ran a really long HDMI cable into a projector in a booth while I situated my observers at a color correction desk, and they controlled the experiment from a wireless keyboard that talked back to my laptop. So the procedure itself, I wanted to have my observers approach it as a role-playing game. And the idea behind this game was that there was some image mastering team that wanted to creatively interpret their images so that they could take advantage of the wide gamut capabilities of the projector, but also keep in mind that they wanted their images to maintain a level of visual pleasingness. So this was a really important part of the study, as it encouraged my observers to select the image that was displaying the high chroma, but it also gave them every right to pick the desaturated of the two if they felt that that one was more visually pleasing. So they did take the test once per each of the 3 images, and each image saturation coefficient was compared to each other twice, once from either side of the screen. And following the paired comparison, the observers did evaluate their favorite image when given the option to select between all 8. So after they were done, all 8 images were shown on the screen, and they had to pick which one they'd choose if given the whole lot. So my observers, I had 36 in total. They were mainly students from the School of Film and Animation, which kind of made the paradigms of experience and age very lopsided. However, the gender paradigm yielded some interesting results that actually kind of surprised me, and I'd be interesting to look at them and share them with you in a bit. But first, let's look at the mean coefficient preferred across all of the images for the whole data set. So what we did was we took the mean coefficient 2 different ways, where we just took the mean of the peak instance at each observer, and then we also weighted that peak by the selections made in the other coefficients. And we did this mainly to make sure that we weren't inducing any weird biases from the paired comparison methodology, as there was a lot of times where observers had to choose between 2 images that they didn't like. So what's nice, though, is we can see that the 2 bars for each image are shown to be relatively at the same level. So that proved that paired comparison did its job. Something that is really interesting, or confirming for us, is that the 3 images are preferred at different saturation levels. And what that shows us is that, yes, there is indeed a dependency on image content that exists in this study. And those results of the differences were all deemed statistically significant by an analysis of variance test. But the thing that I took away from the most with these results was that in each image, they were all preferred on average at a coefficient that introduced some percentage of pixels outside of P3 into the content. So we're seeing that, granted at different proportions, people do like to see the additional chroma added to content. So when we look at those same results but split into the paradigm of male observers versus female observers, we can see that the male observers are preferring the images to be at much higher saturation levels than the female observers. And that was kind of surprising to me. I wasn't expecting it to be that lopsided, but that gives us something to consider when we talk about who the main creative is behind the project and whether or not gender plays a role in determining the level of vividness in the mastered content. So we've looked at the mean saturation coefficient preferred. Now let's look at the mean coefficients preferred and their selections made throughout the study. So to no surprise of our own, we see that the 3 curves for the 3 images are showing different trends. The bride image is seen to be very preferred at the lower saturation coefficients and very much not preferred at the higher ones. Like, for instance, the 3.5 coefficient is only as high as it is because it had to be compared to the 4.0 coefficient, which was very, very saturated. And that mainly goes because the human skin tone became very exaggerated and unrealistic in those cases. The bunny image, however, seems to have the opposite trend, where people are staying away from the lower saturation coefficients, but giving a lot of preference towards the higher ones. It's not a straight line, though, as we do see it start to taper off when it gets very extreme. It becomes too chromatic for people and kind of overwhelming for the image. The mountain image, funnily enough, kind of looks like a mountain, as we see that the observers wanted to explore the extended colorfulness in this image, but they also wanted to make sure that it was realistically approved or realistically grounded. They didn't want to make it look fake. So this plot shows the same exact y-axis as the previous plot, but instead of plotting against saturation coefficient, we plot against what percentage of pixels outside of P3 are preferred. So as we can see with the bride image, once we get more than 5% of the pixels outside of P3, the preference goes way down very steeply. That's, again, due to the skin tone being pushed very far out. However, the bunny image and even the mountain image, their preferences stretch out to around 25 or 30% of their pixels outside of P3. And that's a really big deal, considering the content that's being shown and the amount of colorfulness that could be expanded into the wider gamut. So the idea of the male observers preferring the more saturated versions of the image to the female observers continues in these curves here for the bride, as well as these for the bunny, and these for the mountain. So something else that I did remember was we looked at all 8 coefficients at once and did basically one trial of an 8 AFC following the paired comparison. And what I totaled up here was I looked at the sum of each time a certain coefficient was selected as the favorite for the 3 images. So we do see that the 3 of them are being preferred at different levels, again, which proves our content dependency theory. And we also see that generally the images are being preferred the most at saturation coefficients that are close to the the peak of the previous plot. And if we look at the number of instances that a certain coefficient was the peak versus the number of instances that it was selected during the 8 AFC, we can see that those trends follow very similar shapes and the data overlaps pretty well. There are some deviations in the data that are mainly due to just different methodologies in psychophysics. But this here is another good confirmation that the paired comparison is something that worked out. So something else that I wanted to do was, after all of the paired comparison and the favorite selection was completed, I wanted to have my observers give a strong detail of what was most important to them when mastering the image content, when making their selections of which coefficient was preferred. So for the bride image, I had 36 observers. I can tell you straight up that all 36 of them told me that once the skin tone started to look weird, they went right to the desaturated of the 2 images. That's to no surprise of my own. But what was interesting to hear was that when they were selecting between 2 images of the bride where the skin tone looked appropriate, they actually liked the saturated one, or the majority of them liked to see more colorfulness in the flowers. So even though the skin tone is something that they don't want to push outside of P3, maybe there is something within that image that could yield a higher chromatic master. The bunny image, again, this one was pretty much the king of the saturation crop. They had a lot of preference for bringing it into the butterfly, bringing it into the mountains. However, there was a breaking point for it. There were moments where, especially in the 3.5 and the 4.0 coefficients, the image got very saturated and really became kind of unpleasing. It became overwhelming. A lot of this subtleness of some of the colors became expanded, and a lot of people weren't taking to that well. So there is a limitation. The mountain image, as I said before, this one wound up being probably the most difficult for the people in the study, as they did like seeing the naturalistic scene elements display a nice degree of chroma. However, they wanted to make sure that it didn't start to look fake. It didn't start to look like it was edited in a color rendering software. They wanted to make it look like an image. So that was a tough one, and regardless, it shows that there are some difficulties in telling yourself not to go crazy with the saturation. So in conclusion to this study, the main takeaway from it is that we can really say that there is a use case for the wider color gamuts when considering image mastering. We have seen that observers were directly presented images that go outside of the presented or the standard color gamuts, and they liked seeing higher chromatic elements. So that's something that's a big plus for wide gamut as a tool in the creative arsenal. Though, of course, something that is definitely true is that the content does have a huge influence on what the creative is going to want to push outside of the expanded gamut. They're not going to want to push a skin tone. They might want to push something chromatic like a flower or a sky or something like a memory color. However, once we look at things that are very chromatic, they tend to become overwhelming, which was as expected. However, I didn't mean to bring forth anything groundbreaking with this research, though what I wanted to do was I wanted to kind of open up a conversation between technologists and artists in the industry, as a lot of the tools that the technologists bring into the account are made for the artists, but if the artists aren't educated appropriately about them, then they don't really know how to use them, and it's not something that can come as second nature. But if we are able to converse appropriately, then bringing the expanded gamut into mastered work is something that would be very appropriate. So this was not an easy project by any means. I need to give the biggest special thanks to my advisor, Dr. David Long, as he helped me with this project from the very first idea until this very presentation. I'd also like to recognize the people listed and also give a special thanks to Jacqueline Fitlars and Dolby Laboratories for supporting my thesis work at SMPTE today. So here are my references, and I think there's some time for questions, but thank you all for staying through my presentation. It's a little fast, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Jake. Any questions? I guess we already have one. The mic, please.
Yes, okay, great. I have two questions, or 2 points. The first one is when you're doing a study, what was the observer adaptation? And in between looking at the different picture sets, or the different pictures, was there a chance to cleanse the palette, so to speak, with a neutral adaptation?
Yeah, so everything was run in D65. And so the study worked in either one of two ways, and my observers were able to choose which way they wanted to do it. The first way was they did either one image a day, so they do the bride image, and then the next day they'd come back and do the bunny, and then the next day they'd come back and do the mountain. Or they were able to do all three of them within 1 hour, where they had between 5 and 7 minute breaks just walking around outside of the room between trials.
Well, that raises some interesting questions because if they walk outside the room, they'll be adapted to a different viewing conditions, and I think viewer adaptation, you'll make some quite different picks on saturation depending on how your eyes are adapted. I mean, there's not only color temperature adaptation, there's adaptation to colorfulness in images, so that becomes an interesting point. I think, are they all approaching it at the same time? In other words, if he came back for a second time and he was differently adapted, would he make a different choice?
So I think it wouldn't have made that big of a difference, I don't think. I think that the D65 was pretty standard.
I just know from my personal experience coloring and from others, if you've sat through a lot of really colorful images, more normal images are not going to look very colorful. I mean,
Yeah.
and so I think that can really adapt it. The other point I wanted to make is that the saturation you did is perceptually a consistent way of doing saturation, I mean, doing it in the ICtP space. But I'm unaware of any tools, maybe one that that our company personally has, that actually has that tool available. All others are you can adjust the difference in colors in all sorts of different spaces with drastically differing results, and without handling out a gamut, so you produce all sorts of edge artifacts. So that I think, if you're taking it into a real color correction tool that exists today, or most of them, you're going to be working in a completely different way. Saturation means a completely different thing and will produce completely different results. But very interesting study. I think that's needs to continue. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
So this is a comment or a question about the oversaturation, where the preference goes down.
Okay.
So, you know, I'm familiar with some other papers not going past P3. Young Choi has one, for example. But they're doing the technique you're doing. So I was curious if you thought about, or if you know of any work that has done this, where instead of doing a colorimetric boost, where the colors are kept colorimetrically accurate, but you actually increase the gamut by changing the objects themselves in the scene. So like including more iridescence, stained glass windows, that kind of neon, et cetera.
Okay. That's something that we came across, though we wanted to keep it kind of consistent with what was being shown in the scene, and we wanted to break down the content based off of live action animation and something natural. So thank you.
Hi, my question is, did you do any like statistical studies to know if your sample, meaning like the number of subjects you were working with, was statistical significant?
Yes. So the results for the mean saturation coefficient preferred between the three of them were deemed statistically significantly different. That was also true for the results between the male and female observers for that degree. Within the average selections made, there were some of them that were not statistically significant at the coefficients, but there were some that were. So there was a rigorous statistical analysis put into the results from the study. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.